It had been years since the bombs had fallen on China, leaving the once thriving civilization in ruins. Millions were dead, and the survivors had been left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But in the wake of the destruction, something unexpected had happened. A new society had begun to take shape. The Chinese people had always been resilient, and it was no different in the face of the apocalypse. Despite the destruction of their society, they had managed to rebuild and adapt to their new environment. In the years since the bombs had fallen, they had become a nation of survivors, living on the fringes of society and relying on the resources they scavenged from the ruins of their former lives. They had managed to form small communities, and gradually they had begun to rebuild. The survivors had scavenged materials from the wreckage of the cities and used them to build shelters and farms. They had even managed to find some remnants of technology, which they had used to create primitive forms of power and communication. In the years since the bombs had fallen, China had become a different kind of country. It was no longer the powerful and wealthy superpower it had once been. Instead, it had become a nation of survivors, held together by the strong bonds of their shared experience. The Chinese people had also become surprisingly adept at adapting to their new environment. They had developed an understanding of the world beyond their own, and had begun to explore the other nations of the world. They had even begun to form alliances with the other survivors of the apocalypse, trading goods and services and exchanging knowledge. In the early days of the New World, China had been one of the most powerful nations. But as time went on, the balance of power shifted. Gradually, the survivors of the apocalypse had begun to form their own nation, and the Chinese people had become a part of it. They had become a part of the new nation of the survivors, and they had become a powerful force in the world. They had become a nation of survivors, and they had become a force to be reckoned with. In the years since the bombs had fallen, the Chinese people had gone from being a nation of survivors to a nation of conquerors. They had become a powerful force in the world, and they had become a force to be reckoned with. They had become a major player in the new world, and their influence could be felt in all corners of the globe. But even as they had become a powerful force in the world, the Chinese people had never forgotten their roots. Despite their newfound power, they had held on to their traditions and their culture. They had not forgotten the past, and they had used it as a foundation upon which to build their new nation. And in the decades since the bombs had fallen, the Chinese people had become a major player in the world. They had become a force to be reckoned with, and they had become a major player in the new world. They had become a nation of survivors, and they had become a force to be reckoned with. The Chinese people had survived the apocalypse, and they had adapted to the new world. They had become a powerful force in the world, and they had become a force to be reckoned with. They were a nation of survivors, and they were a force to be reckoned with. The day began like any other day. The sun shone brightly through the windows, the birds sang their morning songs, and the people of the city began their day with hope. But today was different. Today the people of Washington state would face a fate they had never expected. It had been 5 years since the bombs fell. The Great War had come to an end, but it had left behind a new world. A world of destruction, chaos, and despair. Washington state had been one of the first to suffer the effects of the war. Many of its cities had been reduced to rubble, and the survivors were left to fend for themselves. The state had become a wasteland. But despite the destruction, there were still survivors. People who had managed to rebuild their lives and find a way to survive in this harsh, new world. One such survivor was Jack. He had been living in the ruins of Seattle for the past 5 years. He had managed to find a way to make a living, scavenging and trading whatever he could find. He had even managed to make a few friends. But today was different. Today, Jack had heard rumors that something was coming. Something that was going to bring destruction and chaos to Washington state. He had no idea what it was, but he knew he had to be prepared. He had to find a way to protect himself and his friends. Jack quickly gathered his supplies and headed out into the wasteland. He traveled for days, searching for anything that could help him. He scavenged what he could and traded for whatever he needed. Finally, he reached his destination, a small settlement at the edge of the wasteland. Here, he found a group of survivors who had managed to survive the war. They welcomed him with open arms, and he found himself among friends. It was here that Jack learned of the true cause of the destruction, an electronic organism known as the Divine Wind. This creature had been created by an unknown force, and its sole purpose was to spread destruction and chaos. Jack and the other survivors had to find a way to stop it. But how? The survivors decided that the only way to fight the Divine Wind was to create their own weapon. They worked together to build a powerful bomb, using whatever materials they could find. Finally, after months of hard work, the bomb was ready. It was time to take the fight to the Divine Wind. Jack and the other survivors gathered at the edge of the wasteland, ready to face the creature. As the Divine Wind approached, they detonated the bomb. A massive explosion shook the land, and everything went silent. When the dust settled, the Divine Wind was no more. Jack and the other survivors had saved Washington State. They had fought against the odds and emerged victorious. For the first time in years, the people of Washington State had hope for the future. They had beaten the odds and emerged victorious. The survivors celebrated their victory and looked forward to a brighter future. Jack smiled, knowing that he had done his part to protect his home. He had helped to save Washington State. The snow was coming down hard in Moscow, the capital of Russia. It was early December, and the winter chill was already in the air. The city streets were bustling with holiday shoppers, and the winter holidays were just a few weeks away. The people of Russia had been living in a state of unease for the past few years. The world was in a state of political and economic turmoil, and the nation had been struggling to survive. With the help of the United Nations, Russia had been able to avoid the worst of the fallout from the global crisis, but the people were still feeling the pinch. The sky was dark and the snow was falling fast, but the people of Russia still had hope. They had faith that the winter would bring them luck, and that the future would be brighter than the present. The people of Russia were not the only ones feeling the effects of the fallout. The entire world had been affected in some way. Countries had gone to war, economies had collapsed, and tensions between nations had increased. It seemed that the world was on the brink of disaster. Russia had done its best to stay out of the conflict, but it was difficult to avoid getting caught up in it. The nation had been forced to accept refugees from other countries, and its economy had been damaged by the global crisis. Despite the hardships, the people of Russia remained strong and resilient. Inside the Kremlin, the leaders of Russia were discussing what to do next. The situation was dire, and they knew that something had to be done to prevent the world from descending into chaos. They knew that the only way to do this was to make sure that Russia was a strong and stable nation, and that it could weather any storm. The leaders decided that the best course of action was to create a new form of government. They wanted to create a system that would ensure that the people of Russia had a say in their own future. The idea was to give the people of Russia a voice in their own government, and to ensure that their rights and freedoms were respected. The leaders also decided to create a new currency, which would help to stabilize the nation's economy. They wanted to make sure that the people of Russia had access to the goods and services they needed, and that they could rely on the new currency to purchase them. With these decisions made, the leaders of Russia began to make plans for the future. They knew that the world was in a fragile state, and that the nation had to be strong and stable in order to survive. They also knew that the people of Russia had to be involved in the process, and that their voices had to be heard. The winter of 20XX was one of the coldest and darkest in the history of Russia. The country was still in a state of political and economic chaos, and the people were struggling to survive. But the people of Russia still had faith that the winter would bring them luck, and that the future would be brighter than the present. The snow fell harder, and the cold seemed to get worse, but the people of Russia still held on to their hope. They were determined to make sure that their nation would become strong and stable, and that their voices would be heard. They knew that they had to do something to ensure that their country would survive, and that the future would be brighter than the present. The winter of 20XX was a difficult one, but it was also a time of hope and optimism. The people of Russia had faith that the future would be brighter than the present, and that the nation would be strong and stable. In the months and years that followed, the people of Russia would come together to rebuild and create a better future for themselves and their country. The United Kingdom had long been a peaceful nation, content to live in a state of tranquility. However, all that changed with the arrival of the Great War. It began in 2077, when the United States and China engaged in a nuclear exchange that turned the world into a wasteland. The United Kingdom was one of the few nations that did not directly take part in the war, but its citizens still felt the effects. The fallout from the bombs rained down on the land, irradiating the soil and water. The air was thick with the smell of death and decay, and the sky was a constant reminder of the destruction that had been wrought. The people of the United Kingdom were desperate to survive in this new, hostile environment. To that end, they formed the British Commonwealth, a coalition of the surviving nations of the former United Kingdom. It was an alliance of convenience, but it provided the people with security and the chance to rebuild their lives. One of the first steps taken by the British Commonwealth was the construction of a network of underground shelters, known as vaults. These vaults were designed to protect their inhabitants from the radiation that had poisoned the land. The vaults were stocked with supplies and equipped with life support systems to keep their inhabitants safe and comfortable. The vaults were also used to store the records of the past, so that the people of the United Kingdom could remember and learn from their history. Some vaults were even equipped with state-of-the-art medical facilities, providing their inhabitants with the best possible care. The vaults became the backbone of the British Commonwealth, providing a safe haven for its citizens and a way to rebuild a new, more prosperous nation. But even with the help of the vaults, the people of the United Kingdom still face many challenges. The land was littered with land mines, and the water was contaminated with radiation. The air was toxic, and the people were forced to live in makeshift shelters made of scrap, metal and wood. But despite these hardships, the people of the United Kingdom persevered. Slowly but surely, the citizens of the United Kingdom began to rebuild. Towns and cities were reconstructed, and the land was slowly reclaimed. The citizens of the United Kingdom even created their own form of currency, known as bottle caps. This currency was used to barter for goods and services, and to provide a way for the citizens to keep track of their finances. But the citizens of the United Kingdom were still far from safe. Radiation still lingered in the air, and the land was still filled with danger. The people of the United Kingdom developed a new way of life, one that focused on caution and self-reliance. The citizens of the United Kingdom also developed a new culture, one that was rooted in the past, but also embraced the new opportunities that had been created by the fallout. The citizens of the United Kingdom embraced their new world, and they created a new society that was both unique and resilient. The citizens of the United Kingdom had survived the Great War, and they had emerged from the ashes of destruction stronger than ever before. They had survived the worst that the world could throw at them, and they had created a new way of life. The citizens of the United Kingdom had created a new society, one that was based on cooperation and compassion. They had created a new world, one that was filled with hope and promise. The citizens of the United Kingdom had created a new future, one that was built on the ruins of the past.